In the middle of 253, the Signet Classic, please. Last part of the second paragraph. He took a piece of, I said piece yesterday too. He took a pace or two up and down. Then he continued less vehemently. The first thing for you to understand is that in this place there are no martyrdoms. You have read of the religious persecutions of the past. In the Middle Ages there was the Inquisition. It was a failure. It set out to eradicate heresy and ended by perpetuating it. Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition. So the Muslim Moors conquered Spain in the 1400s, and then the Catholic Church said nah, and went in there and went door to door, accusing, vilifying, and arresting and executing people believed to be Muslims. It was called the Spanish Inquisition. It was done by the Catholic Church against suspected Muslims in Spain. That's that reference. Set out to eradicate heresy. Heresy against church doctrine, against church orthodoxy. Heresy. So, like, I'm not going to stand when the priest says we need to pray to Jesus. That would be heresy. Or, I think I'm going to have communion even though I'm not baptized. That's heresy. Some religions think that's a sin if you do that. For every heretic, it burned at the stake. Thousands of others rose up. Why was that? Because the Inquisition killed its enemies in the open and killed them while they were still unrepentant. In fact, it killed them because they were unrepentant. What's repent mean?
To make up for your sins by punishment.
Please, God, give me a second chance, please. Men were dying because they would not abandon their true beliefs. Naturally, all the glory belonged to the victim and all the shame to the inquisitor who burned them. Top of 254. Later, in the 20th century, there were the totalitarians. So, Stalin, Lenin, Mussolini, Rodrigo in Spain? No. Yes, maybe. Hitler, as they were called. There were the German Nazis and the Russian communists. The Russians persecuted heresy more cruelly than the Inquisition had done, and they imagined that they had learned from the mistakes of the past. They knew, at any rate, that one must not make martyrs. Before they exposed their victims to public trial, they deliberately set themselves to destroy their dignity. They wore them down by torture and solitude, and they were despicable, cringing wretches, confessing whatever you put into their mouths, covering themselves with abuse, accusing and sheltering behind one another, whimpering for mercy. And yet after only a few years, the same thing had happened over again. The dead men had become martyrs, and their degradation was forgotten. Once again, why was it? In the first place, because the confessions that they had made were obviously extorted and untrue. We do not make mistakes of that kind. All the confessions that are uttered here are true. We make them true. And above all, we do not allow the dead to rise up against us. You must stop imagining that posterity will vindicate you, Winston. Posterity, after death, post, will never hear of you. You will be lifted clean out from the stream of history. We shall turn you into gas and pour you into the stratosphere. Nothing will remain of you. Not a name in a register. Not a memory in a living brain. You will be annihilated in the past as well as in the future. You will never have existed. Hope you're marking that page. I think you ought to be putting the torture dial in your dissertation vignette, at least, or maybe even the whole rack that he's laying it on. If you need to see what a torture dial looks like, look up Rambo torture dial on YouTube. Rambo, Sylvester Stallone, like blood and guts type army movie in the 80s. There was 3 of them. Then why bother to torture me, thought Winston, with a momentary bitterness. O'Brien checked his step, as though Winston had uttered the thought aloud. His large, ugly face came nearer, with the eyes a little narrowed. You are thinking that since we intend to destroy you utterly, that nothing that you say or do can make the smallest difference. In that case, why do we go to the trouble of interrogating you first? That is what you were thinking, was it not? Yes, said Winston. O'Brien smiled slightly. You are a flaw in the pattern, Winston. You are a stain that must be wiped out. Did I not tell you just now that we are different from the persecutors of the past? We are not content with negative obedience, nor even with the most abject submission. When finally you surrender to us, it must be of your own free will. We do not destroy the heretic because he resists us. So long as he resists us, we never destroy him. We convert him. We capture his inner mind. We reshape him. We burn all evil and all illusion out of him. We bring him out to our side, not in appearance, but genuinely, heart and soul. We make him one of ourselves before we kill him. It is intolerable to us that an erroneous thought should exist anywhere in the world, however secret and powerless it may be. Even in the instant of death, we cannot permit any deviation. In the old days, the heretic walked to the stake, still a heretic, proclaiming his heresy, exulting in it. Even the victim of the Russian purges could carry rebellion locked up in his skull as he walked the passage waiting for the bullet. Pause. So what he's really saying is that it's kind of backing up what we said yesterday. Do you want to die bravely for a cause? Or do you want to live and fight that cause for as long as your life? So I'm against what am I against? I'm against the smarter balance test requirement. So I'm going to run out on Argonne and go, no smarter balance, down with smarter balance. And I'm going to get run over by a Mack truck and die. Yay. And like maybe one person hears me and goes, yeah, state testing sucks. But no one else does. And maybe I get one headline out of it the next day in the paper, but no one reads the paper, so no one.
Crazy guy screams.
Yeah, it's going to be crazy guy who knew what he was talking about, and then it's going to be memory hold. But if I live every single day and I get t-shirts made and I promote how standardized testing is horrible, and I go to the meetings, I go to Olympia and I lobby and I run for Congress and I live to fight that fight. What's more powerful? That's what O'Brien is saying, really, but he's doing the opposite. If we just start murdering people that are against our orthodox culture, their message could be bastardized by the people that survive, and they could be turned into martyrs. Like Jesus is a martyr. He died for other people. And then other people then lifted his memory up and started telling stories about his life and what he was about and stuff. That's a martyr. And if a government does that to its people, like let's say all murderers we're just going to execute, but there's going to be a couple that are going to have a social media account that was pretty popular, right? And that'll just make their social media accounts bigger in death. They will become martyrs to the cause that you are trying to kill. Have you ever heard you cannot kill an idea? And by trying to kill an idea, you might and probably will only make that idea stronger. Look at, we've had a war on terrorism for over 23 years. Did we get rid of all terrorists? Or did we just make more of them?
We made more, I'd say.
Yeah, and Osama bin Laden is a martyr to the people that believe the extreme religion
and
stuff.
Like, all the oppression we've done to the Middle East, I think just makes it worse too.
Yeah, we're fighting Hamas. They're terrorists. They're only making more Hamas people by killing mothers and fathers.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that's exactly what O'Brien's saying. We're not going to kill you, Winston, you dope, because then you might be a martyr.
So
but
I wouldn't say even if it's just Hamas. All the whole Palestinian genocide also just like.
Yeah, and did you see what the president said yesterday?
Mm-hmm.
We could just take over all of that land and relocate them. That was said in the White House. What's relocate mean?
Concentration camp.
But we make the brain perfect before we blow it out. The command of the old despotisms, authoritarian dictatorship, despot, dictator. Thou shalt not. The command of the totalitarians was thou shalt. Our command is thou art. No one whom we bring to this place ever stands out against us. Everyone is washed clean, even those three miserable traitors in whose innocence you once believed, Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford. In the end, we broke them down. I took part in their interrogation myself. I saw them gradually worn down, whimpering, groveling, weeping, and in the end it was not with pain or fear, only with penitence. Penitence, kneel before God, penitent person. By the time we had finished with them, they were only the shells of men. There was nothing left in them except sorrow for what they had done and love of Big Brother. It was touching to see how they loved him. They begged to be shot quickly so that they could die while their minds were still clean. Top of 56. His voice had grown almost dreamy. Dreamy. Stockholm Syndrome. The exaltation, the lunatic enthusiasm was still in his face. He is not pretending, thought Winston. He's not a hypocrite. He believes every word he says. What most oppressed him was the consciousness of his own intellectual inferiority. He watched the heavy yet graceful form strolling to and fro, in and out of the range of his vision. O'Brien was a being in all ways larger than himself. There was no idea that he had ever had or could have that O'Brien had not long ago known, examined, and rejected. His mind contained Winston's mind. But in that case, how could it be true that O'Brien was mad? It must be he, Winston, who was mad, crazy. O'Brien halted and looked down at him. His voice had grown stern again. Do you imagine that you will save yourself, Winston, however completely you surrender to us? No one who has once gone astray is ever spared. And even if we chose to let you live out the natural term of your life, still you would never escape from us. What happens to you here is forever. Understand that in advance. We shall crush you down to the point from which there is no coming back. Things will happen to you from which you could not recover. If you lived 1,000 years, never again will you be capable of ordinary human feeling. Everything will be dead inside you. Never again will you be capable of love or friendship or joy of living or laughter or curiosity or courage or integrity. You will be hollow. We shall squeeze you empty, and then we shall fill you with ourselves.
Ew.
So what's he saying right there is what we've been saying this whole time. We're going to numb you so much that you're not going to care. You're not going to be capable of anything because you'll be so numb from our torture, or from TikTok, or from Reels, or from stories, or from name it. Yeah, we'll remove the ability of critical thought. So remember those quote-unquote terrorists who were illegally black-sighted around the world in the early 2000s? There's a movie about it called Zero Dark 30. There's still 16 of them in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, where we're going to start sending immigrants to stay. It's a naval base. Those 16 quote-unquote terrorists have never been charged with crimes. Their families were never notified, and they cannot spell their names. They don't even know their names because their names have been tortured out of them by the U.S. government that you paid for. He paused and signed to the man in the white coat. Winston was aware of some heavy piece of apparatus being pushed into place behind his head. O'Brien had sat down beside the bed so that his face was almost on level with Winston's. 3,000, he said, speaking over Winston's head to the man in the white coat. Two soft pads, which felt slightly moist, clamped themselves against Winston's temples. He quailed. There was pain coming. A new kind of pain. O'Brien laid a hand reassuringly, almost kindly, on his. This time it will not hurt. Keep your eyes fixed on mine. So imagine that. You got wet electrodes attached to your head, and the wet, spongy part goes onto your temples, and you need to stare at O'Brien while they're doing whatever through the electrodes into your head. At this moment, there was a devastating explosion, or what seemed like an explosion, though it was not certain whether there was any noise. There was undoubtedly a blinding flash of light. Winston wasn't hurt, only prostrated. Although he had already been lying on his back when the thing happened, he had a curious feeling that he had been knocked into that position. A terrific, painless blow had flattened him out. Also, something had happened inside his head. As his eyes regained their focus, he remembered who he was and where he was, and recognized the face that was gazing into his own. But somewhere or other, there was a large patch of emptiness, as though a piece had been taken out of his brain. It will not last, said O'Brien. Look me in the eyes. What country is Oceania at war with? Winston thought. He knew what was meant by Oceania, and that he himself was a citizen of Oceania. He also remembered Eurasia and East Asia, but who was at war with whom? He didn't know. In fact, he had not been aware that there was any war. I don't remember. Oceania is at war with East Asia. Do you remember that now? Yes. Oceania has always been at war with East Asia, since the beginning of your life, since the beginning of the party, since the beginning of history. The war has continued without a break, always the same war. Do you remember that? Yes. 11 years ago, you created a legend about 3 men who had been condemned to death for treachery. You pretended, 258, that you had seen a piece of paper which proved them innocent. No such piece of paper ever existed. You invented it, and later you grew to believe it. You remember now the very moment at which you first invented it? Do you remember that? Yes. Just now I held up the fingers of my hand to you. You saw 5 fingers. Do you remember that? Yes. O'Brien held up the fingers of his left hand, with the thumb concealed. There are 5 fingers there. Do you see 5 fingers? Yes. And he did see them. For a fleeting instant, before the scenery of his mind changed, he saw 5 fingers, and there was no deformity. Then everything was normal again, and the old fear, the hatred, and the bewilderment came crowding back in again. But there had been a moment, he did not know how long, 30 seconds perhaps, of luminous certainty, when each new suggestion of O'Brien had filled up a patch of emptiness and become absolute truth, and when 2 and 2 could have been 3 as easily as 5, if that were what was needed. It had faded out before O'Brien had dropped his hand. But though he could not recapture it, he could remember it, and one remembers a vivid experience at some remote periods of one's life when one was in effect a different person. You see now, that is at any rate possible. Yes. O'Brien stood up with a satisfied air. Over his left, Winston saw the man in the white coat break an ampoule and draw back the plunger of a syringe. Break an ampoule. That must be like the bottle that you put the needle into. And drew back the plunger of a syringe. O'Brien turned to Winston with a smile. In almost the old manner, he resettled his spectacles on his nose. Do you remember writing in your diary that it did not matter whether I was a friend or an enemy, since I was at least a person who understood you and could be talked to? You were right. I enjoy talking to you. Your mind appeals to me. It resembles my own mind, except that you happen to be insane. Before we bring the session to an end, and you can ask me a few questions if you choose. Any question I like? Anything. He saw that Winston's eyes were upon the dial. It is switched off. What's your first question? What have you done with Julia? O'Brien smiled again. She betrayed you, Winston. Immediately, unreservedly. I have seldom seen anyone come over to us so promptly. You would hardly recognize her if you saw her. All her rebelliousness, her deceit, her folly, her dirty-mindedness, except everything has been burned out of her. It was a perfect conversion, a textbook case. You tortured her? O'Brien left this unanswered. Next question. Does Big Brother exist? Of course he exists. The party exists. Big Brother is the embodiment of the party. Does he exist in the same way as I exist? You do not exist. Once again, the sense of helplessness assailed him. He knew, or he could imagine, the arguments which proved his own non-existence, but they were nonsense. They were only a play on words. Did not the statement, "you do not exist," contain a logical absurdity? But what use was it to say so? His mind shriveled as he thought of the unanswerable, mad arguments with which O'Brien would demolish him. Yeah, I'm going to argue that "you do not exist" is ridiculous because you're saying "you" and you're saying it out loud. Then what if I don't exist, and why do you have to say that? But then see, you look insane the more you try to debunk the big lie. Perfect example of it. I think I exist. I'm a conscious of my own identity. I was born and I shall die. I have arms and legs. I occupy a particular point in space. No other solid object can occupy the same point simultaneously. 260. In that sense, does Big Brother exist?
I think also there can be like some kind of truth to like you don't exist because like people are so propagandized to, like hate something until it's like completely erased from like society. That's just like that's just like in the eyes of some that they don't exist anymore. And yeah.
It's a paradoxical question. It's like one that goes back to Plato.
It's definitely paradoxical, but I still think there's some truth to it.
Are we talking about the ship?
Hmm?
If a ship goes on a journey for a long time and all of the parts change during the course of its
Ship is
lifespan,
Theseus?
is it the same ship? Are we talking about that?
The ship's species, no.
Oh, never mind.
Does Big Brother exist? It is of no importance. He exists. Will Big Brother ever die? Of course not. How could he die? Next question. Does the Brotherhood exist? That, Winston, you will never know. If we choose to set you free when we have finished with you, and if you live to be 90 years old, still you will never learn whether the answer of that question is yes or no. As long as you live, it will be an unsolved riddle in your mind. Winston lay silent. His breast rose and fell a little faster. He still had not asked the question that had come into his mind the first. He had got to ask it, and yet it was as though his tongue would not utter it. There was a trace of amusement in O'Brien's face. Even his spectacles seemed to wear an ironical gleam. He knows, thought Winston suddenly, he knows what I'm going to ask. At the thought, the words burst out of him. What is in room 101? The expression on O'Brien's face didn't change. He answered dryly, You know what is in room 101, Winston. Everyone knows what is in room 101. He raised a finger to the man in the white coat. Evidently the session was at an end. A needle jerked into Winston's arm. He sank almost instantly into deep sleep.